Today I wanted to talk about the suffering of attachment, which of course is something of a cliche in Buddhism. So it can be easy to fall into the mistake of thinking we understand or thinking we know about it already. But if you really understood it, then you'd be at least a sotapanna. So you didn't understand if you're not. And if we haven't grasped this point deeply enough, then whatever meditation we do, whatever kind of practice we do, will not work. It's really something that is like the base of all the practice. Anybody who went forth as a monk in the time of the Buddha and attained things afterwards began by understanding this point. Otherwise, they could not have renounced as they did. There are so many stories, many people gave up families, riches, wealth, children, status, other religious practices to which they had dedicated their whole lives. All the same kinds of things that we are all attached to, that make up what our lives are about. They gave up all of that, so they could not have done that if they had not understood deeply the nature of attachment. While we can all kind of see easily enough that attachment is suffering, that whenever you're attached, you're going to cry. Whenever you're attached to something, it's going to cause you anxiety. Whenever you're attached to something, there's going to be suffering of some form or another. It's as straightforward as somebody else loses their watch. You really don't care. You don't have any suffering on account of that. But if you lose your watch, now you will be bothered by it. So immediately, anything that bothers you is rooted in the fact that you're attached somewhere. You cannot be bothered by anything at all if there is no attachment there. It's impossible. At the same time, the idea of having no attachment, of being completely detached from things, is sort of repellent. It's not an agreeable idea for somebody who's a beginner. And that's basically because our whole lives consist of a series of attachments. And so the idea of having no attachment is like imagining oneself dying almost. And it's also because the only kind of pleasure or happiness that we know, that we can experience, is based on attachment. Somebody else's child is not a source of pleasure or joy, but my child is. So, as an ordinary person, both our happiness and our suffering is completely and entirely dependent on the state of all our various attachments, whether they're going well or whether they're going badly. And this would be no problem, except that we have absolutely no control, and it's impossible to have control, to have a say in whether our attachments are going well or going badly. And so, regardless of the fact that pretty much our entire life is based on defending, protecting, struggling to keep our attachments intact, to keep them from falling apart, to keep them the same. Nonetheless, still they persist in falling apart, in being lost, in turning against us. Whether it's like a material object that we're attached to, or our job, or other people, or our own body, they are all completely and entirely out of our control. They are not ours to keep, to protect, or to defend. We cannot, as much as we try. So that's why being attached, being dependent on them, whatever it is, any attachment, is inevitably, it has to be a source of suffering, both because it's impossible to be secure about it. There will have to be anxiety, fear over losing it. Plus, then when we lose it, it causes us more suffering. So it should be clear enough from this, but it's important to emphasize the point that it's not the fault of the things in the world that we suffer. They're there by themselves, and there is no need to suffer on account of them. It's only because of holding on to them, being attached to them, that we suffer, purely because of that. Because we don't recognize the nature of things, because we don't recognize the fact that we have no control over them, and we persist in trying to have control over them and trying to keep them when they persist in nonetheless continuing to go against us. A very nice analogy for the suffering of attachment is a little anecdote that Ajahn tells about when he was about 5 years old, very young, and his mother and father brought him to visit the house of his older sister, who was adult and had children of her own. And so, being of a curious nature, he went exploring in the upstairs of the house and he came into the bathroom. And at some point, he found a box of brand new razor blades. And so, this he was so impressed by how beautiful and shiny they were with a little alligator on them. It was as if he had found treasure. So, of course, he had to have them. And so he started taking them out of the box and putting them into his hand, and he was holding them tightly so that they wouldn't fall. And so, of course, they started cutting into his hand and making it bleed. And he kept adding another one, another one, another one, and now the bleeding started to hurt and he started to cry. But still, he was not letting go of the razor blades. Not at all. He was continuing to add more and more of them while crying in pain. And this continued until at some point his parents and his sister came looking for him and they saw him with all these razor blades in his hand and his hand bleeding everywhere. And so they just said, drop it, drop it. So then, of course, he dropped it and now it was like, okay, this was what was causing my pain finally. So this story illustrates really well the useless suffering of attachment because it's quite clear that it's sort of nonsensical, stupid to want to hang on to hold a razor blade in one's hand. The razor blade itself is not a problem. Like, we can own a razor blade and have many and use them as we wish. But for Ajahn at that young age, it was only because he was so in love with how shiny they were and he wanted to keep them for himself that he hung on to them and held them in his hand like this, thus causing himself pain immediately. So it's exactly the same with whatever we're attached to. For example, somebody who is no longer attached to the body doesn't stop having a body, doesn't need to stop having a body. The only difference is that they're not hurt by it. They're not hurt emotionally when the body changes, when it gets old, when it gets sick. They can have like the physical sensation of pain in the body, but it will not go further than that to become a source of emotional disturbance because it's just a physical sensation, disagreeable physical sensation in this body that I know is not mine, was never mine to begin with. It's a borrowed vehicle. Or to look at another aspect of attachment to the body, for somebody who is very attached to their physical appearance, every little change in physical appearance, every little dot that appears on the skin is a cause of suffering, is a cause of disturbance. But they cannot stop the body changing as much as they would want to. That's just its nature. And for somebody who is unattached, the body will change in exactly the same way, but there's no cause for suffering to arise on account of that. So again, it's important to understand it's like the razor blades. They cut you only if you use them wrongly, like Ajahn used them wrongly when he was a 5-year-old. So it's the same with the body. It hurts only when it's taken up wrongly, when it's held onto. People try all kinds of methods to keep this kind of way of thinking, keep this attachment, keep this holding on to the body, while trying to prevent it causing them suffering, trying to stop the body aging, trying to prolong life, trying to keep the body the same, the appearance the same, the faculties the same, trying to hold it more in order not to have the suffering that comes when inevitably it changes anyway. But of course, the more you struggle against the inevitable nature of things, the nature of this body to change and to decay and to die, the more you dig yourself into more ignorance, more attachment, and more suffering. Ajahn was giving the example that it's like falling. If you fall off your chair, then it might hurt a bit, but you will not die because of that. But if you fall from the top of the building, that's another story. In this example, the strength of the impact from your fall is caused by your position in relation to the earth, which always stays the same. So it's the same with attachment. The depth of our suffering is determined only by our position in relation to that thing which, like the body is maybe the best example or the easiest one to see. It's there anyway, minding its own business. It doesn't need us to be attached to it. and it's only when we're attached to it that we suffer. So here I've given mainly the example of attachment to the body because it's relatively easy to understand this point in relation to attachment to the body, but the same thing goes for any attachment. So the main point I wanted to make here really is that it's not to just hear this one time and think that we've understood that it's over and that we're done. The Buddha's teaching is about you, your life, and it is correct. It applies to every one of us, regardless of whether we choose to practice or not. If we wish to practice, if we wish to understand the Buddha's teachings, then we need to be able to see these things for ourselves. If we were to fully understand this point about the suffering of attachment, then it would be like realizing that we have something burning hot in our hands that's burning us, that we've been holding on to, and we would let go of it. So why don't we let go of it? That's the question. How come we still think it's a good thing?